You could have heard this episode 48 hours early on our Patreon, patreon.com/indieheadspodcast. By joining us for as low as $1 a month, you'll receive episodes early and gain access to our Discord server. All of our upcoming episodes will be up on our Patreon 48 hours before it hits our public podcast feeds. But if you're hearing this via our Patreon feed, we thank you so much for your support. We especially want to thank our Real Ones patrons, including Becca NTN, Georgia Mikowski, Alex Grichmanoff, Baby Buko, Josiah Duncan, Jenna LaFleur, Grant McSpooky, Old Man Withers, Jackson Chris, Alex, Matt Kapczynski, Mark Berry, Aaron Hillsamer, Darian Fisher, Gay Horse 420, Cal 50, Mommy I Just Went Boom Boom, Chris Wade, Jacqueline Kataga, Alec Felder, Eraserhead Baby, Selectric, Rob Marino, Dylan, Waffle113, Noah Kurtz, Tony DeSerafino, Maze Farms, and Derek Pemberton. To become a Real One, consider supporting us with a $5 a month donation for receive bonus episodes every month and get a shout out at the top of the pod. Anyways though, enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of the Indieheads podcast Album of the Year 2021 podcast series. I'm your host, Matty Evergreen Prince, and if you listen to the last episode, of course, I am joined by Lily, Jackie, Natalie, and Rose. And by joined by, I mean they're talking, and I'm just kind of just sitting here and just making sure everything goes according to plan.
You'll have more to contribute to this half, I think.
Maybe. Is the list itself proof alone that nothing is going according to plan, according to where the Indieheads podcast started off?
Yes, let me just state right now. Okay, I think 6 out of our 10 this year are in my 10. And our top 4, bar Dreamwell, is my exact top 4. That scares me. That has never even gotten close to happen. I am usually lucky to have like 1 to 2 of, my guys, so to speak, in the top 10. This year, our 10 is basically just my 10 and quite literally my 5. So I'm about to have a real fun time. This is never going to happen again.
Yeah, I have my, what is it? Our top 5 has like 3 of my top 5 in it. So this is just kind of where we are.
Again, we didn't engineer this. It just happened that way.
I got 0 in the top 10s in my top 10.
I said it.
I know Spirit in there. We were very close to having Spirit in there, but did not. But it does not. Again, just because we tried doesn't mean that the fact of the matter is 0 of my top 10 is in the top 10. I'm not mad about this. Let me just state that for the record. I'm not mad about this. Because I'm not mad. I swear to God, I'm not mad. Because this is something I'm totally used to. I'm used to like basically nothing in our top 10 being in my top 10 or like maybe 1 or 2 things. But this is like really like usually at least in the top 10. I said this in the last episode. I'll say it again. Usually there's at least like 2 or 3 records like, hey, it wasn't in my top 10, but I like them. I can talk about them. Sorry, folks. It's
that's me with some of these. Like
it's a bunch of chunkies for me, everybody.
I've already gone off on some of my real big favorites, and some of these are just like I like them. I don't like them as much as other people, but I like them. But you know what? This is a really good list this year, and not just because it happens to coincide with a lot of our very specific. It's just that like this year, as has been discussed, was not a great year for consensus records. Like the first album we're going to talk about today is like the most consensus record of list season, which is hilarious.
I don't know. There's another one on here.
There are. It's true. There are a couple on here that this half of the top 10 more aligns with like the rest of list culture as compared to the first half of the top 10, which was literally just like the trans girls have taken over the feed. But yeah, I'm very excited to get into this and to get into this first record, which is a record that like I've heard a lot of people discussing about, but mostly it's either just people saying, oh, this is really good, or people saying like, why is this really good? I don't really get the appeal of it. And so I'm ready to like kind of get into the weeds a little bit with this first record, which is Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders, Promises. You've probably heard about this record if you've read an album of the year list this year. I believe it has the number one spot on that aggregate Excel spreadsheet that someone puts together every year. That like,
I think it's either that or Lil Sims, because Lil Sims has been like,
it was Lil Sims number 1, Promises 2, and then Tyler the Creator 3, which.
What a fucking year!
Who would have thought?
We are so out of step with that.
But also, I'm kind of in step. I didn't put Tyler in my 10, but that's the best Tyler the Creator record by a pretty wide margin. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders,
the London Symphony Orchestra
and the Londons should not be left out. They're
they get their part.
Yeah, they're hauling ass too, especially once it kind of keeps going. But this is a very unique record. It's a record that has been hyped from even before the moment it came out. I remember there was a tweet where it was Fortet, I believe, Kieran Hebden, who tweeted, the best thing you're going to hear all year is the Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders record with the London Symphony Orchestra. And I said, the what with the who?
Yeah.
and the what now? And so this record was like in kind of niche ambient music world, like a pretty big headlining thing, but it's been very cool to see it pick up with other people because this is not a record. It's kind of hard for me to rank it because it's so its own thing, and my relationship with it is so different than a lot of these other records where like every other record on this list I've either come back to constantly or I've come back to every once in a while and been like, this is really good. This is a record that I haven't spent a ton of time with for some reasons we can kind of get into, but like my first listen of this album, the first time I heard this record, when you sit down to listen to it for the first time, was one of the 3 or 4 coolest things that I experienced this year. Like just in terms of like letting it wash over you and realizing what the structure of the piece is, and we can kind of get into all the like nitty gritty of like how this thing is pulled off. But it's a magic trick, is what it is. It's a how many parts is it? 9 parts? 8 parts?
9 parts.
Nine parts, and they're all just labeled like part movement 1,
movement
2.
1, movement 2.
Yeah, and then the whole record is structured around this 1 7-note motif that just keeps repeating throughout the whole thing and kind of constantly leaves you with this like, it's an unresolved sequence of notes. Basically it like doesn't reach its melodic resolution, and so as a result every time it plays through it's like a question mark. It's like it ends on this on you kind of waiting for the next thing, and that has this effect of like just collapsing time in the way that you process this record. And so it just feels like this constantly flowing thing where you'll be listening to it and you're like, this is really cool, let me check in and see how far I am into the record, and you'll be like 6 songs into it and you're like, wait, what the fuck? Because the whole thing is completely seamless. It's meant to be appreciated as one movement from start to beginning. And I'm not the right person to really and I don't know if any of us are, to really like give context on like who Pharoah Sanders is and like why his involvement with this record is so cool. But like as someone who's been a big fan of Floating Points' music for a long time, I think that this, even though it's a very, very different kind of experience to the Floating Points record that came out last year, which I really like also, Crush is a great record. That's more kind of typically what you'd expect from a Floating Points type, and this is more kind of like free jazz, ambient, new classical type thing. But it doesn't, that probably sounds very homeworky if you're not into this sort of thing already, or if this isn't something you've checked out. And I think the thing that just should be clear about this record is how accessible it is, and how if you have absolutely no musical context for this sort of a thing, you'll still be pretty wowed by it, even if you can't like articulate why it's so special and understand maybe why this is like the album of the year for so many people. I think it's just really fucking cool, regardless of whether you're like me and you're like, oh wow, what a cool sonic motif that doesn't resolve in all of the music journals and blah 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 blah. Like it's just a very cool, like you can put it on in a very dorm room poster, like let's take a massive bong rip and put this on for 45 minutes and like lie on the floor and like get real new agey with it. Like it works in that way, but it also works under close dissection. It's like just a really perfect piece. And even though I haven't been listening to it the way I have some of these other records, like I won't forget what it was like to hear this for the first time.
Yeah, now, as a big London Symphony Orchestra head, I just want to say...
This is some of their best work yet.
Okay, so actually,
Best
like,
collab since
I
Cypress
think,
Hill.
like, the main thing I like about that particular motif is just the way it's kind of used in, like, this, like, almost droning kind of way where you just, like, let it blend into the background a lot and let the other instruments go to the forefront, even as I kind of, like, stands as like this alarm sort of reminder of like, hey, this is still going, you know, and like in the moments when it's really exploding, like you almost don't notice it's there anymore to a degree.
It's
Yeah,
collapsing
totally.
time, but also it serves as like your reminder of like, all right, the same amount of time has passed since this last played.
Yeah, I remember, Jackie, you kind of primed me with the notion of the motif, and yeah, it is so subtly integrated that like I remember listening and thinking like, okay, cool. Like, when's that motif going to come in? And then realizing after like 10 minutes, like, oh, that's the motif.
Just that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think on my end, like this was like one of those things where it's like the weird trend for me this year is, other than like the like metal stuff that I was talking about when we were talking about Modern Grotesque, like the thing that has been the thing for me is like albums that have these recurring motifs, because like the other one I was really into this year was the Bell Orchestra that does kind of like a similar trick, but like this one is just that kind of collapsing of time is so, I think, pivotal to that first experience, just because like Jackie was saying, I had the exact same reaction the first listen, which is where it really kind of compounded on me, where you hit like movement 6 and you're like, oh, this is like this, how long has this been going on? Because the thing about that motif is its unfinished nature is what kind of allows it to feel like time itself is kind of closing in on itself and more time has passed than it has. And once that hits the movement 6, where it kind of, the orchestra starts swelling and it becomes, it takes the minimalism and the ambient nature of it and really kind of starts exploding it out, is where it really kind of allows itself to kind of settle into the amount of time that it's taking up. Because I believe that is also, if I remember correctly, the longest track on the album.
Yeah.
And it's the one where there was the most kind of like dynamics and like development over the span of the movement kind of happening. And I think it's just really kind of fascinating that you have essentially these 3 very distinct kind of like types of artists all kind of coming together to create this like unified thing that sounds like nothing else. Because it's not really, it's kind of unfair to compare this to any other sort of like ambient album in recent years. It's not really like particularly like fair to compare it to like, say, any kind of like recent jazz releases, because of how like it goes into the minimalism, and also like the orchestral thing, the orchestral pieces of it feel like flourishes that are kind of building out on everything else. And so it creates this like really unique blend of things that doesn't seem like it will work on paper, but when you hear it, it just kind of it becomes this all enveloping like singular piece that just kind of washes over you.
I also really like with how kind of set in stone that little motif is, and how it sort of creates this sort of sense of like regularity to the piece, where it just keeps happening on those same intervals, but it also just like maintains this tone throughout. Then you have Pharoah Sanders, who is the saxophone player that is like so loose with his ability to just kind of weave in and out of that structure that's created, and sort of like dance around what Floating Points is doing with his playing. And so it like creates this effect of, you've got this one very minimal, very tone setting piece of instrumentation as like the backbone, and then you weave this saxophone line around it like a snake that's like ensnaring it, and then you've got the really big wideness created by the orchestra that then allows those two things to feel like they're not existing in this small space, but that these two elements are like spiraling outward into space, into vastness, into largeness. And like that is what makes this record so compelling, is it manages to take you from like this very small granular thing where you're really focused in on like, you're really hearing, like you can even hear like Pharoah Sanders, like his fingers on the keys of his instrument, like really like delicate, intimate kind of recording of this performance, but then it kind of expanding out to feel really cinematic and huge at the same time, and the way that it like expands and contracts over the course of the album is just really fucking cool. And also there's a sequence of short tracks and then a sequence of tracks that start getting longer, and how that like fucks with your sense of the time and how long the record is taking. It's all just like so particularly calibrated, and is so even though it's so abstract, that's like everyone kind of has the same experience with this record, which I think is really cool. Like whenever I hear people talk about checking it out, like they all kind of have the same, like I put it on and I was enjoying it, and then it kept going, and then it got to like movement 6, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. And it's funny that movement 6 has like 3 million more plays on Spotify than everything else on here, which is just like,
oh, interesting.
Some people are just like, yeah, can you give me the like short notes version of it where I can listen to the whole thing in 9 minutes? And like movement 6 kind of does give you that, but I will just say this is a record that you should listen to from start to finish if you want to get the full effect of it. People on Indieheads who are commenting, yeah, I didn't really get
Yeah, I was gonna get to that guy.
The guy who was
some
like-
guy fucking commented like on one of the Indie of the Year lists, like I only listened to like 3 moments of this, and I don't get it. I don't get why everyone likes this. I quit 1/3 of the way through. What is wrong with you?
It's like someone saying, yeah, I liked Sixth Sense, but I left during the second act, and I just didn't really get what the big deal with that movie was. Like, why was everyone freaking out so much about it? And it's like, I don't want to reduce this album down to like it is a trick. I think it's so much more than that, and I think the kind of collective feeling of it is so much more powerful than the sum of any of its parts, and the way it builds over time. It's just like this kind of cascading sense of feeling that just waves over you, and the way that motif gets beaten into your head, so that when it comes back, keeps coming back, it keeps having like new meaning for you, and you keep being like, all right, I thought I had heard this thing enough, and I had heard it as many, and it was starting to float out of my vision, but then it just kind of creeps back in, and you're like, right, it's still there, but I'm hearing it differently now in this different context, and like how you lose sense of that in the soup of it. It's just really cool. I think this is
back to your analogy about like M. Night Shyamalan, like in a similar way that like I feel like a lot of people kind of reduce like M. Night Shyamalan's work to like, oh, there's a twist and that's all the movie really needs. But like the thing is, like he builds it out from there, like so
Totally.
you can still make it a watchable thing even when it's not. And like the same with this, like yes, there is a big moment in this that it all kind of hinges around, but like it's still worthwhile as a full experience. Like even with that, like the parts before it are compelling. Everyone, as I mentioned before, like everyone gets a little part. Like there's, a section for the symphony orchestra, and then there's bits where you can just hear like Pharoah Sanders' voice, and then just like there's little bleepy bloop bits for floating points.
Yeah, exactly.
But like everyone is here.
It all melds together really well, and I do think that this is a record that sometimes I feel like there are certain records that get critically overvalued because they are really great like pieces of meat for critics to dig into, as opposed to really great records. And I think that's like something that I could lob at, for example, many of Ice Age's records, not to just throw shade unnecessarily, but like records that seem like they are more interesting texts for critics to write about than they are albums for people to listen to in their kind of day-to-day lives. And I could see that sort of a complaint being lobbed at this record, but I think that would discredit how listenable this record is, how like pleasurable it is in kind of a straightforward traditional way, and how like emotional it is. I think that like Pharoah Sanders being a very old man who has had this long career and is very like respected, but to have someone like Floating Points be like, I am going to take your music and I am going to take it into this context that is simultaneously giving it like more pomp and circumstance with the London Symphony Orchestra, but also like is showing a new generation of experimental music fans, hey, here is like how my music is impacted by these legends of free jazz, and how that it can translate to a more modern kind of electronic acoustic arrangement, and how all of those elements work so perfectly together that you don't really think of this as like a collab album. Really, it just feels like this grand piece that unfolds before you that is just really incredible and cinematic and beautiful.
Yeah. No, the part of where I think this really kind of, I think, I like supersedes its like reputation in terms of like us describing the core elements of it is in moments like on this track where it does kind of keep the skeleton of what's going for it, whether it be like the different people who are contributing to the album or like the central motif, and really kind of swirls around in itself in unexpected ways where at certain points of like certain movements the like central motif almost kind of gets buried under all of these ways that things are building on top of it or kind of coming in. It becomes this sort of thing where talking about it in the sum of its parts is like, I think, alluring in its own way, but it is not even doing justice to the kind of cumulative effect of letting it all kind of like just unfold.
Mm-hmm.
This is very relevant as the resident trans girl here who has the inner soul of a 45-year-old Pitchfork critic. I have to defend Ice Age against Jackie.
We do not need Ice Age defense. We roasted them enough on the last episode.
That is fair.
I'll stick up as a noted Ice Age enjoyer, although I also can't entirely deny what Jackie said re their last two albums.
No. The last two are my favorites, but okay.
I think Beyond This is way better than the new one. We'll leave it at that.
That I can agree with.
New one got hard memory hold for me. I need to listen to it. Period.
New one is one of the few things this year that I actually remember, which I don't know what that says about me. But anyway,
you know what else
I can buy into it.
Remember from this year? Our next album.
Yes, we should.
We should remember.
Hang on. Actually, first we need to shift into a new mode here.
Oh, yeah.
I think we're going Billy mode.
We're
going a little bit Billy mode.
Oh, we got Billy mode now?
We're going to go Billy mode. We're going to go fan mode. We're going to go lyric mode. We're going to alternate between the modes. We're going to get into it. We've done this once already. This is one of the only new albums I feel like we actually talked about in length, along with the Lingua album and some of the other new music that came out. But it's Billie Eilish, people. It's happier.
And we talked about it on an episode that I missed, which I was very upset about because this is like one of the few albums I really, really have strong feelings about this year. And I was like, damn it.
Well, now's your
chance.
chance.
Get takes out. I do also want to set this up. I realize, incidentally, I mentioned in the Dreamwall talk from last episode, talking about a little hospitalization I had this year. During that same hospitalization, I watched a little Apple TV Plus exclusive documentary called The World's a Little Blurry, having only heard like 1.5 Billie Eilish songs before. But I was like, you know what? It's a documentary mostly shot on iPhones anyways. I can watch this on an iPad in a hospital and not really care about picture quality. So like, also, when else am I going to have 2.5 hours of spare time to watch a pop musician documentary? But let's go. Let's go see what this like pseudo industry plant nonsense is about or whatever. And over the course of 2.5 hours, I just slowly began to realize that Billie Eilish and Phineas are like the two best songwriters on the planet. Like minute 10 even, I remember, like there's a sequence where like she is like talking in her family's living room and then just starts singing out of nowhere, and like your jaw drops because you're like, oh, this is just a kid who had gold, like was born with gold falling out of her mouth. Like, whatever else you can say about those two, if you watch that documentary, there is immediately no denying that they have like it and have managed to use it incredibly successfully, like already at this point in their careers. And also, like I mentioned like the industry plant thing in jest, but like in watching that documentary, like the thing I did not realize is like, okay, yes, these kids were like born in LA to like, you know, rich showbiz parents, but they are not really like, they did not benefit from the trust fund baby genre of nepotism, really. Like what the documentary sort of outlines is that like as kids, basically, they told their parents like, hey, we want to do this. And they were like, okay, if this is what you want to do, then like do it as much as you humanly can. And so from the ages of like 12 and 8, they were just like studying around the clock on how to become incredible songwriters, to the point where now at the ages of 20 and 24 or whatever, they're like better than anyone else in the game. And watching that, it was just incredible to see that all unfold. And I was like, hey, I don't know if I fully got that album, but like, this family kind of rocks. And like, I get it. I respect these two now. Let's see what they do next. Cut to what they did next, and it fucking rules.
Yeah, like, I think that first album was like just okay. It was kind of buoyed by like some really good singles, but like this one, oh my god.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the chat a couple weeks ago, going back to When We All Fall Asleep, that album, like if you trim that album down to the 5 best songs, it would be in the running for like best pop EP of the century, basically.
Mhm.
But then it does have all that kind of other stuff around it, as I also outlined. Like When We All Fall Asleep is very much like the college admission paper, where it's like, okay, you got something. It's not all the way there yet, but like there's definitely something here. So, show us what else you can do. And then Happier Than Ever, which we are talking about currently, is like the graduating thesis, where it's like, oh yeah, you proved that you know how to do this just like better than anyone else to an almost like uncannily effortless degree. Like they make the songs good, and they work a lot on making sure that the songs remain good throughout the process. That the songs end up being better than anyone else who is like trying to make these songs. It like kind of defies logic, where it's like, oh, you two have done this so much and like somehow gotten your Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours in before you could like legally drink, to the point where you just know like the exact most interesting, engaging, tasteful, like smart, technically accomplished songwriting decisions to make. And like listening to this album at a point, you're just like, oh, that's such a, like, it almost makes you feel defeated. You're like, that's a great choice. And so is that. And like, how did you find the exact right direction to go here? And it just never ceases to be operating on this sort of like standard of excellence that is completely unrivaled in mainstream pop music. Like another early thing I said about this album was like, we are living in the only timeline where Billie Eilish isn't opening for Halfwave right now. Like an album that is this interesting and weird and cool should by no conventional logic be one of the biggest albums of the year. Like the person who made this should not also be like hosting and performing on SNL at the same time and also like B20. Just like nothing about it makes sense at all. But holy crap, I'm ever glad we got it. And I realize I've like talked around the content of this album a lot so far.
Because there's a lot of content.
There's so much content, and it's basically like, if I really get into the content, like I sort of foreshadowed, I'm just going to start delivering hyperbole after hyperbole, like especially as someone who has been like really kind of getting obsessed with like the math and the craft of songwriting and pop songwriting over the year, and really becoming fascinated with that. Is like, again, these two just have an instinct to take the songs in the exact most interesting, most effective way they need to go at like almost all times.
Mm-hmm.
It's consistently remarkable that again, this is a major label pop album that is like that good throughout.
And I think
I am going to shut up soon. This is my Porter segment.
Go ahead.
And like, that should also be a disaster, by the way.
Yes.
Like the extremely young, like questionable industry plant artist who has like an improbable breakout run at the Grammys off the strength of like 2 songs, making the like follow-up, trying to be experimental and minimalist, like pseudo singer-songwriter album that's all about how like being famous and 19 at the same time is really hard, you guys. Like, this should suck.
It should.
And anyone else doing this would have made it suck. And again, we are in the only timeline where this record just like completely lands and manages to pull itself off in a way that just kind of defies any explanation beyond, again, as I said, they remembered to make the songs good.
Yes.
Nobody else did that this year. They were like, yeah, we made some songs, they exist, and you're like, yeah, but are they good? And they're like, well, we didn't really look into that. And with this, they're like, no, we like locked ourselves in a room for a year and made every song was very, very good. We made sure.
Yeah, like I feel like there's, you know, a whole genre of this kind of record of like really young breakout stars who like get really big fast and are just like, fuck this, I hate this so much, and they make a whole record about it, and like it's a very mixed bag usually, because like they just don't know how to process these feelings in a mature way through songwriting, and I feel like this record really does it remarkably. Like,
Yeah, I wanted to make the exact same point, which is that, like, not only is the Reaction to Fame album like a thing that has existed for like as long as show business has existed, practically. Like, you can go back to Nirvana and all sorts of people that have become famous and have mixed, complicated feelings about it, and then release art about it, and a lot of it, including some of the ones that came out this year, even what records that are not bad, like the Clairo album and stuff that's like, this is fine, but it just feels a little like celebrities navel gazing a little bit and being like, let me dive deep into my internal psychological world while the world around us is like going to shit. And that has two different potential outcomes. You can either deliver something that is very boring and very kind of sleepy, and just like, yeah, this is interesting, but like, is it really? There's not anything musically interesting about it. Or you could go in the opposite way, where you're just like completely failing to read the room, cough cough lord, and making an album that is like trying to forget about what's going on right now, but is also trying to do commentary, and the commentary is like kind of heavy handed and whatever. And the thing that I think makes this record so fascinating is that, like, I've been thinking about this record a lot in relation to Lana Del Rey, which is not surprising to anyone that's been in a Discord with me recently. And how this album similarly is like touching so close to things that should be cliche or should be worn out by now. But the difference between the way that Billy does that and the way that Lana does it is that, like, Lana is like saying, yes, this is a cliche, this is an overused object, and I am going to swing it around like a prop, like a big like American flag hat that I'm wearing, and like I am going to make it into this campy, ridiculous thing. And what Billy does is that she just does cliches in a way that the moment they come out of her mouth, they're not cliches anymore. And that's the hardest fucking thing to do in the world, is to deliver a story that you've heard before and you can immediately grab, like when you hear My Future, like the song that is like, is it the actual intro to the album, like the very first song? Like,
no, it's
that's Getting Older.
Getting Older. That's what I'm thinking of. Getting Older and My Future, like those songs that are like, should feel like this formulaic, like, here's, check back in with my life, here's what I'm up to now, I'm dealing with these emotions, and it's kind of hard, but like, you immediately just connect with her on a personal level in a way that is so hard to do with these albums that have so much artifice around them. And you immediately are just like, you're able to see the not only just like the person, but like the very young person, the very like, her rise to fame, as we talked about in the Billy Mode episode, like happened so fast that it's like she couldn't even have like she couldn't even let it get to her head, because it's like she was rocketed up the escalator so quickly that she was like, how the fuck did I get up here, what's going on? And as a result is having these very earnest reactions to everything, but is doing so in a way that doesn't feel like it's entirely about her. And even though it is so specifically like, this is my experience with like being sexualized the way that I was as a young person, and how I didn't like that, and how dealing with trying to have interpersonal relationships while being like one of the most famous people on the planet, and translates all of those like very specific, very privileged experiences into something that like teenage girls around the country can immediately listen to and be like, oh, that's me. Not in the way not in the way of that meme on Twitter where it's like, wow, he's literally me, like the neckbeards watching like whatever. Like it's that I understand Billie Eilish's life, even as someone who is also an LA princess, is like, I understand her life is very different than mine in so many ways. But from the moment I put this album on, I'm like, I get what you're going through, and I'm able to find so much in here that is relevant to my life and not just your life, Billie Eilish, the celebrity. And like, that's what makes this so different, I think, than a lot of the other reaction to fame albums. I will say that this record is a little too long in the way that the Porter record is a little too long.
I'll get into that because I
do have thoughts.
I will just say real quickly.
I will get into my thoughts on the structuration. I'm sure, Lily, you're about to say some of the same things as me.
I'll let you guys rebut my point. I just want to say that, like, I think this record is in the same exact way that the Porter record is, so I can't really throw stones in glass houses. It feels like 1.5 albums, where it's not like there's a half an album that sticks out like, oh, this should have been cut out and turned into its own thing. I really don't know how to do surgery on this album to make it how I want, besides just cutting off the couple of songs I don't like as much. But none of those songs feel like they're necessarily filler. It just feels like there are two different versions of this album there could have been. The one that is like way more stripped back than people were expecting it to be, that's just the more ballady stuff and just like happier than ever and cuts out a lot of the kind of clubbier instrumentation. Or there is the record that feels more like the exact follow-up to the first record that we were expecting, that has like NDA and Oxytocin and Goldwing and all of that kind of stuff on it. It feels like the evolution of the last record and the refinement of the last record. And I think those two things mesh together, but it never really feels like I need to listen to this record all the way through as this one cohesive experience. It's a record that I come back to and I'm like, today I'm feeling like listening to these 3 songs, and today I'm feeling like listening to this song. And we've joked a lot about the 3 modes this album was presented to us in, but that's kind of how it feels to me. Is it's like I can constantly kind of go to this and like hit whatever buttons I want to hit on the Billy machine and get exactly what I'm looking for out of it. But I'm very rarely like, I want to go sit down and like absorb this whole thing all the way through, partly just because it's a lot of songs and goes in a lot of places, but also because I just kind of like it more in piecemeal fashion. But there's not a lot that like I'm like, this song needs to go, this song needs to go. There's really only like 1 or 2 that I don't really like as much as other people.
Yeah, so I sympathize with that, even though I can't really relate to it. I do get that. Like, there's definitely an argument to be made for the fact that this album is like 2 or 3 songs less away from being a 10. And yet, like, weirdly, like you said, to its credit, everything is so tightly braided together that like you can't really single out like, oh, that's just filler that I would remove or whatever. Like, it is all tied together so tightly that, you can't really extract any one element.
There are no obvious shortcuts you could have taken. It's not like an Alex G album where like on an Alex G album, you're like, okay, dude, you could have just jumped from step 3 to step 7 here. And those steps in the middle, you kind of don't need, and you could just keep the album moving. It's not like that where there's like, oh, clearly
it's like a GPS telling you to like turn left 20 times in order to get to a destination that's like on your right.
Yeah, even if I can like say on paper, like, well, if you kind of get rid of like the Haley's Comet, not my responsibility, overheated run, like that's a bit of a dip. But then if you skip over that, like that run is still like
one of my favorite parts personally. So
here's the thing, like the you can't get rid of those tracks because like those tracks have like, you know, thematic pairings, and that's like something I want to get into about the structuration of this album is like nearly every song here has like a second song that is like perfectly tied to either like in a literal musical level, like they transition into each other very brilliantly, or they're just like so thematically tied. Like you look at Not My Responsibility, and then you look at Over Here, which literally like samples the like background ambient instrumentals that she's using in Not My Responsibility to like make this own crazy beat that it does. And like you look at NDA, Therefore I Am, and like they go perfectly back to back, and it's just like every little choice that they make in like structuration and style is like so perfectly tied together that it feels just deliberate
Mhm.
and very smart. Like every listen I've given this, I'm just more and more like, wow, this is really smartly built.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which I think is like the conclusion I've come to, having given this a lot of front to back listens. Is like the more time I spend with the songs that didn't necessarily wow me at first, the more I'm like, no, these are like a little more subdued, but they're still like
Mhm.
equally great, to the point where those like admitted objective slumps don't really bother me anymore, because I'm like, hey, you know what, this is just what the album is now. And then we're gonna get back to like those just undeniably like rock solid opening and closing stretches.
Yeah, like if you're mad about the middle, you literally have like one of the best like 4-song closing stretches imaginable. Like with
Yeah.
Your Power, Indie, Therefore I Am, Happier Than Ever, Male Fantasy, like just absurd closing run.
I will
Yeah.
say my one kind of like actual sticking point with this record is I don't like Therefore I Am as much as everyone else, just because it feels the most like old Billie Eilish. And not that I wasn't into Billie Eilish, but like it was fascinating for me how quickly Billie Eilish transformed in my mind to something that I was like hypothetically, theoretically into. And when I heard the first record, I was like, well, this isn't for me, but like good for the kids that they have this, because it's cooler than a lot of the alternatives. And then how quickly it like flipped the switch into no, actually this is for me and it's really good. And that's just one of the tracks, like Therefore I Am, and also kind of NDA, which I like that song. I don't like it as much as everyone else likes that song. There's just the fact that those two songs come so late in the track list and feel the most derivative of what she was doing before. You kind of get the sense that it's like, okay, you could have maybe left these off the album and they're kind of being wedged in just to have them on here. And like, Therefore I Am is a huge fucking hit. That song has a bajillion streams on Spotify. So like, I understand why it got wedged into the album and why probably the label was like, these songs exist in the Billie Eilish lane that was already there, and so we need them in order to continue bolstering what you were doing while you're building off of it, which I get.
Steven, I want to bring up
I
a crazy
object to
thing
that.
about streaming numbers real quick. The biggest hit from this album is like a 6-minute guitar ballad at the very end of the record. Like
Happier
it
Than
is
Ever.
doing
We need to have a whole discussion about Happier Than Ever,
Yes.
the title track.
Yeah, we will get to that
Before-
one in a minute, but like holy shit.
Exactly.
Yeah, before we do, I want to, just because I feel like it bounces off of Jackie's point well, I'm going to publicly eat my hat about basically my initial conceptions about this album, because I vividly remember I had listened to the debut album back when it was like big in 2019, and like other than the singles hadn't really had it sink in. And despite that, kind of like getting attached to the singles again when we were doing like the car commercial series made me be like, okay, so like maybe this is an artist that I should be paying attention to. She seems like she's doing something differently. When this album came out day of, I vividly remember being like, yeah, no, I'm enjoying they're like really, really like strong songs, but like basically being like, this album is overlong. I don't really know if I'm vibing with like the first half of it. And it was specifically like hitting that span at the end that Jackie was talking about, where I feel like I think the strength of that stretch specifically is it is kind of reintroducing that style, but slanted in a way that basically turns the lyrical sort of approach to it on its head, and specifically kind of brings the album full circle. Specifically because the album does start with Getting Older, as we've talked about, just because coming off of an album that is such a big resounding critical and commercial success, and being in this like very strange position for somebody of her age to be in, where she is basically given this platform of like how people are viewing her, and like almost kind of putting her on this pedestal when she did not intend to get there at whatsoever. It becomes this kind of looming thing over the entire album that is meant to be this this is where I am. This is where I'm kind of like internalizing those feelings, and that's kind of going to permeate everything. And that's kind of where I think when it does eventually like reach NDA again, it becomes kind of this like point where the path that the album takes to get there and kind of the flow that we've been talking about all kind of makes sense, to the point where it's like, now that whenever I do re-listen to this album, it kind of becomes a thing where the flow of it and those kinds of pairings that Rose is talking about are so vital that it almost kind of flies by much faster, just because it feels like less so than like particular tracks. There are like kinds of spans or stretches of the album that I've grown accustomed to kind of like seeing as kind of more coherent, like things where I kind of view them more as like collections of tracks or ideas or kind of pathways rather than like 16 individual songs. I will say that like my one kind of sticking point is my weird take about this album is that I kind of wish it ended on the title track, because I feel like the title track is such a really big statement in its own that it could stand on its own. And the more I've listened to it, the more I feel like Male Fantasy, at least where it is, doesn't really feel like it is. It doesn't feel as much of a culmination of the ideas of the album as the title track does, personally.
I do like Male Fantasy as an epilogue. Like, there's definitely an argument to be made for it not working as such, and for the title track, obviously being the moment that you kind of like go out strong on. But I do like it. I also think it brings a lot of stuff like thematically full circle, especially in regards to sort of like undercurrents in the album regarding like, abusive relationships and stuff. Like, I think paired with getting older, it's sort of, again, we're talking about bookends on the last episode too, like it nicely showcases this arc of having like a lot of like pent up trauma and resentment. And I think Male Fantasy presents this very poignant, just letting go of like, again, the last line of like, no, you know what? Like, I probably should be angry, but I don't think I can really bring myself to do it. I just want to sort of like hold on to my tenderness, even if I just had this like big angry explosion in the last song. Like, that's not necessarily the type of person I want to remain. And so I think because of that sort of like more meta-thematic element, it works for me, even if like, on a songwriting level or a musical level or whatever, like, yeah, maybe you could get rid of it, but I don't know. I'm too in the Stan waters to like really pull myself out of this one. I'm like, I don't know. I like it all. I can't dispute everything, but it's just all so good. And I keep listening to it. And I think a telling thing about the sequencing on this album is that like, I can't think of many other albums where I will like start it at these specific points and then kind of reliably find myself listening through to the end. Like, as much as I say to myself, like, yeah, I'm just going to do that, like, My Future Oxytocin Goldwing run right now. Eventually I end up on Male Fantasy and like same thing, dropping the needle at like Everybody Dies or Your Power or whatever. Like, it as soon as wherever you like start in the record, you just kind of find yourself like lost in it and flowing through it.
It is.
And
It's like a good movie, like on TV, where you're like, oh, I like this part. Let me just sit by for the next couple of songs, and then all of a sudden you finish the movie. Like that is
100%. That's
kind of
very much been my relationship with it. And to like jump off a couple of other things Jackie was saying, like, yeah, I think the way this album is able to succeed in its subject matter is the thing that like Billie has done that like surprisingly few other pop stars have managed to do with the fame thing, is not be like, oh, my fame is a problem, a personal problem, like in and of itself. And like, that's going to be the only angle we look at this through. Like, what she really smartly identifies and hones in on is like, no, my problems with fame are the tip of the iceberg upon which everyone else's problems live. And so like, I am going to use this very like singular position I occupy to, and like, I'm going to deconstruct that in a way that like, sort of signals perhaps more like mundane everyday things or like broader systemic things that like everyone else is going through, and that I just like happen to be the flashpoint of. Like, it's not as personal as it is. It's not solipsistic. It is able to say like, oh, here's how like the very specific weird famo stuff I am going through like ties into the everyday stuff everyone else is going through, and like how this is indicative of like a broader problem, or many broader problems with like the way the world operates. It's one of those things where you're like, oh, I can't believe so few people have managed to bridge that gap successfully thus far.
Yeah,
because none of them are as smart as Billy.
And I think all of that gets hammered home so well by the title track, which is we should talk about the greatest fucking thing. It is so unbelievably good, and I think there are a lot of things about it that like need to be appreciated that aren't, because I think the first thing that everyone's like, oh my god, the end of the song, and the end of the song is great. I will talk about the end of the song in a second, but I said this in the chat. The thing that might be more impressive than how hard this song sticks its landing and how hard it sells, like the build up to the Your Best American Girl style, like anthemic rock breakdown, is that she manages to make ukulele not lame. How did it happen? How is it possible that when this song starts and she's doing the when I'm away from you, I'm happier than ever, wish I could explain it together, I wish it wasn't true, over that ukulele, like it just, like I said, like it should be cliche, it should feel twee and like overdetermined and like trying too hard, and it doesn't. It feels so natural, and and the progression of the song is so so well executed that you put the song on and you're listening to it and you get wrapped up in the narrative of the song before it starts exploding. So oftentimes when I put the song on, I will like go into it with the intention of like, oh yeah, it's going to build up to that big thing, and every time it kind of sneaks up on you. It doesn't feel like the whole song is just building to this one explosion. It feels like it's telling the story, and then all of a sudden it just kind of, the emotions take a left turn, and all of a sudden it explodes, and the music is able to like respond at the same quickness that Billy does, and without just making this like a kind of dunk on Olivia Rodrigo, because I do like that album and I like how kind of petty that album is in its own special way. Like the thing that drove me nuts about Driver's License was that was a song that like I think was an okay song. I don't think it's good. I think it's kind of a bad pop song, but I get why people like it, whatever. But I feel like so much of that song is about the extraneous. Like, do you hear that there's this Disney Channel star that she broke up with, and this is what happened in their breakup? And you can listen to the song, and you can attach these TMZ headlines to these lyrics, and then how different that is from Billy going like, I don't talk shit about you on the internet. I never told anything bad because that shit's embarrassing. You were my everything and all you did was make me fucking sad. It's like, I don't want to write this song because I want to like put you in your place Taylor Swift style. Like, I want to write this song because you were a jackass to me and you didn't have to do that. And I never did anything to encourage you to do that. And how it just strikes right to the heart of like the emotional truth of the situation rather than like the cliche artifice of the breakup song, and how these things that she says that feel so straightforward manage to feel so like when she says that all that you did was make me fucking sad, that should just feel like a teenager saying like a cliche thing, and it feels so like resonant. And then also how the song ends with like, it starts in this place that is so composed and so put together and so like classically beautiful, and then the album then it ends with the outro of you ruined everything good, always said you were misunderstood, made all my moments your own, just fucking leave me alone, fuck you, goddamn, fuck you like it comes from such a like articulate writerly place, and then it goes all the way to just like this completely petty like emotion that is so true and is so accurate to how she really feels, and it just is like a miracle that the song is able to channel those feelings like a lightning bolt.
This song makes me feel how I imagine most Rolling Stone writers feel every time they listen to Good For You by Olivia Rodrigo. Where I'm just like, oh my god, a pop star with guitars!
Yeah, it does feel really revolutionary in a way that it shouldn't.
It's like such a brilliant sort of move with the production, like the way it kind of silently slips into that electric guitar mode before you even realize what's happening.
Yeah.
It just really just like crashes in with that.
Totally.
It's very smart, like everything on this album is.
Yeah, and again, like weirdly, a running theme for this, smart in a way that doesn't feel like homework. Like it is so studied and accomplished, and yet like you never lose the sense of like spontaneity and playfulness and immediacy that it all has. And like the title track is a very great example of that. Also, like just the fact that like none of like really like the big mic drop lines in the second half of the song are like actually where the catharsis comes in. Like, I don't know, personally for me, like weirdly, like the biggest moment in that song is I don't relate to you anymore because I'd never treat me this shitty. Like,
Oh yeah, I don't.
and that one just kind of like slips by compared to like the very overall like here's where I'd put a line about how you showed up on time.
Oh yeah,
Which
that
like
line
is that's a long fucking walk, I admit, even though I do kind of love it, but like a lot of the more concise little nuggets where she slips in, like, again, like
I could talk about
this very unassumingly intense catharsis.
Yeah, the line is, I could talk about every time that you showed up on time, but I'd have an empty line because you never did.
Yeah, that's a long walk to home base right there.
But it works.
It works. That's the thing. It's like these are such like stupid swings on paper, but just like when you hear them in execution, you're just like, oh, of course you make it work.
Yeah.
Okay. I also really like
She's going Billy
the
mode.
lyric, "You made me hate this city," because it's a very it's obviously very like cliche, whatever, but it's also like it's such a perfect LA thing because it's like it gets to the heart of this idea that like this place should be the fucking best. It's all you other people that fuck it up and make me think of this place as an awful place when it should be like paradise or whatever. Like how LA is paradise except for all the people that move there because it is paradise, and just how someone can ruin your place where you feel at home by treating you awfully there. And yeah, it's a really great song that has lots of that like pettiness, but it doesn't feel as kind of put on. Like starting a song with "Do you read my interviews or do you skip my avenue when you said you were passing through? Was I even on your way?" Lines like that are just like, oh fuck, you're just dead to rights, dude. Like,
Yeah.
getting hung out to dry like laundry.
Yeah, we should move on now because you talked about this album a lot, as it deserves. I want to set this one up because after a long time going Billy mode, I think, it's finally time for us to ask what, in my opinion, is a very important question. Arguably, maybe the question of the year. It's time to ask, hey, what? People have been asking, hey, what? It's one of those miraculous things where, in a time of, immense personal and global strife, both for Low as a band and for everyone, that, they managed to pierce through the suffocating void of this sort of, dystopic post-COVID, post-double negative reality. And they managed to do it with a resounding, hey, what?
So we should to formally bring us here. This is number 3 Low. Hey, what that we are talking about?
It sure is. Oh, what an album!
And I just want to say before we get into serious discussion of this album, the way that they say "hey" has made me think for weeks. What if you replaced every "hey" in this song with Michael McDonald Peg? What if? Just think about that.
I know there's an idea.
I feel like musically, the closer analog would be like the 3 Days Grace, pain.
Which we established. We should try and figure out what the triad of the pain, the peg, and the hey are. I think you could make a chord out of those. You could. That's probably an augmented chord right there.
Paying. It's so I guess I'll hop into it.
Go ahead.
My
I think
thoughts,
you're the biggest head of this album here.
So I feel like I am the one among this quartet of people who was like very, very double negative pilled when that album dropped a few years ago. That was actually the thing that got me into Low. Before then, they weren't really on my radar, particularly because I wasn't a like slowcore type person, but it was particularly how that album renegotiated what they're all about with these kinds of BJ Burton noise elements that I think really kind of burst through to this idea of taking the kinds of strains and troubles that were already at the center of their lyrics and filtering them through a sort of societal lens that was even more fraught and in distress than normal. And because of that, and because of where the production on that album kind of takes those ideas, and particularly how that album flows, because I feel like that is kind of previous Low albums always felt cohesive just by virtue of their sound being so kind of like singular and idiosyncratic even among slowcore. But I feel like with that album, that is really where the production almost kind of becomes a third member of the band, where you are having these sorts of flows that are really kind of creating a seamless piece of music. And when the first single on this one came out, Days Like These, I was mostly just kind of curious about how that was going to work, just because so much of Double Negative, the lyrics kind of get obfuscated to very intentionally in a point where there's this very noisy haze going on and you often can't understand what is even being sung. And so in that sense, the production is standing in for this sort of intent that the lyrics are trying to impart. But there, it kind of blends in this far more crisp style than they have before, this very sort of upfront, clear production on their vocals while also still incorporating the noise. So it was one of those things where I was like, I'm not sure how this is going to work, because like when the bursts of noise on that track came in, I was like, I see where this is going. I'm not sure how this is going to work. And the second I heard the very beginning of White Horses, which is what kicks off the album, and you're just hearing these like loud, very processed guitars come in, and then immediately once it kicks in, you hear BJ Burton chop them up into this like very bizarre kind of like staccato beat that's going on behind both Alan and Mimi's vocals. It was clear that it was just, oh, this is just taking that and like infusing it with a kind of clarity that album didn't have, which I think lends the albums, both of these two albums, like two very different effects, but really kind of creates something that is especially kind of potent in terms of kind of positing what happens when you take the sort of muddled and very confusing, overwhelming nature of everything that was going on when Double Negative was coming out, but also render it with all of this kind of like painful clarity in recognizing what is going on and what needs to change and what is kind of plaguing you as a person. And I'll let other people get into it, because I know that other people have like different slants they want to take it on, but like where I'm mostly just really, really a fan of this album is how it kind of negotiates those noise elements with the kind of clarity of their more slowcore stuff, while also keeping in those like that idea of the album being very cohesive and coherent, just as a complete product, because that's similar to how some people are talking about the Billy album. Kind of my thing with this album is I find I can't really take it as like individual tracks other than maybe like one or two, mostly like something like Days Like These or The Price You Pay at the very end. But like other than that, it's because so much of this is considering kind of how certain songs flow into and out of one another and how they're like responding to different things, to the point where the one interlude on here is there's a comma after Still, which is a callback to the hook of White Horses. There's just so much going on here that to the point where often I find myself often kind of needing to recall like what certain songs are even called, because I so clearly think about this album as like movements and spans that it kind of collects and collates, and how that kind of creates a cumulative whole.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, like the really incredible decision this album makes is like sidestepping the question of after, a Double Negative, it's like, okay, well, do you go clearer or do you go heavier? And like somehow with this album, they managed to thread the needle and go like, well, we're going to go both. Like we're going to place our vocals like front and center in the mix and sort of harken back to that really like clear, intimate quality that our early material had. and yet we're going to surround it by like our heaviest, most oppressive textures that we have done to date as a band. And it's just like, I still just can't believe they squared that circle. And you like immediately understand when White Horses starts, you're like, oh, they really like answered that question in the perfect way, and in a way that is so thematically appropriate, both as a follow-up to Double Negative and as just an album existing in 2020, that like, you know, everything is going to be simultaneously way too like close and overwhelming, and yet there's going to be this sort of like unbearable pointillistic precision to it at the same time. And the way the album is manages to carry those sort of contradictory elements through as a cohesive whole is so inventive, and a really effective and smart thematic choice for them to make. And I think is really like the key to how the album succeeds, again, both as a standalone work and as something that is in dialogue with the rest of Lowe's work and, you know, with the rest of the world, arguably. And similarly, it's like, oh, how do you follow an album that was like very much, you know, in dialogue with, you know, the sort of goings on of like the Trump era? With this, like, you know, there is a reductive angle to it of like, oh, this is like Lowe's post-COVID album or like their quarantine album or whatever, which like, yes, in a sense, but more broadly, it is just a means of, I think, reflecting the lens through which a lot of us are reflecting our own experiences now, which like we're going to make the album even more political by diving even more into the personal and sort of making some of the most like disarmingly candid and transparent songs about our own relationship with each other that we've ever done too. And this is going to come, you know, as like the centerpieces or the sort of defining pieces of, again, the sort of the most thematically broad and ambitious and incisive thing we've done to date as well. It's so cool how they managed to keep all those plates spinning in a way that like I totally wouldn't have expected, but now that I hear it, I'm like, right, this is of course the only way you could proceed as this band, you know, at this point in your career.
Yeah, I feel like after a certain point, like, they kind of needed that pivot. Obviously, I'm not a Lowhead, because, like, I've never liked anything they've done before this. I've tried the slowcore stuff a lot. It's not taken. I tried Double Negative. I thought it was neat, but, like, needed more focus. And so, of course, they made the album that finally, you know, takes the little refinements that I wish were there in the previous work and really makes it something worthwhile. Like, I can't really speak as much to, you know, the lyrical prowess of it, but like the production of this thing is like some of the most fascinating I've ever heard all year, just in the way it kind of like manages to craft beauty out of like such explicit noise. And like something to consider is like there are no synthesizers on here. Every sound is made with like guitars.
Yes, I want to comment on that actually.
Which is fucking bewildering to consider.
Yeah, no, the what is really astounding for me and what really kind of put it over for me is so my girlfriend Abby and I went to go just because they are Minnesota locals. They did a couple of album release shows right when the album dropped that weekend, and we went to one of them very, very fittingly, I should say, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which seems a little too on brand for its own good. But one of the things that is like really startling about like hearing this album, which they played in full in that context, is just kind of how much there are these like very sturdy melodic bones in there, because the way they did it live is almost no noise elements other than what they could recreate through pedals, and it is almost entirely done like pseudo acoustically, and it is stark realizing kind of going back to the album in that context and being like, oh, so this is just a guitar sound that just got really fucked up somewhere along the way.
So I want to get a quote from BJ Burton on this album, which is very important. I feel like it demonstrates his mindset as producer. A lot of Hey What is very ketamine based.
Yes, I forgot about
I got
that.
into that, and it kind of changed my life for the better. Some of that album is like ketamine trails to me, the Sonics. It's like going through a ketamine trip for a little bit. That song Hey is really big. I want it to lift people up for an out-of-body experience or some shit, because that's how I felt when I was trying to make it.
Which, like,
yeah.
First of all, that rules. Also, let's pivot into Hey Talk, because I feel like it kind of just, You got to give it a hey. Oh, what a little song of the year contender for me. I had a very special relationship with that song over the course of a few months. I don't even know how to talk about that because, talk about a song that just does not really sound remotely like anything I've heard in my life. Like if you were to pitch me on paper, like, oh, the big 8-minute centerpiece of this album is going to be like a thudding four to the floor thing that is very anthemic and yet somehow does not have any drums at all. And that is just going to dissolve into this wall of, noise and drone that extends itself up to like 5 minutes. And also it's going to be about like a fight that a couple had, and somehow through that also be about like absolutely everything else. It is such a wild achievement of a song. I really cannot think about anything like it.
I haven't said anything yet. I like this album a lot. I have somewhat complicated feelings about it that I'm trying to like parse still, which is similar to how I felt about Double Negative, but I was specifically going back to it before today. I really like the first half of this record, like through Hey, really works for me. I really, really like White Voices.
White Voices.
I hear you paint horses.
I just turned into Joe Pesci for a second there. White
Any
Horses.
crime committed, Pesci is quick.
You're goddamn right. I really love White Horses. I really love Disappearing. That song is fucking incredible. That's like probably the heaviest song on the record. And I think Hey itself is like one of the band's great singular achievements. Like Hey is worthy of all of the hype. I don't like Days Like These like at all. And I think there are some points in the rest of the record where I really like how upfront their vocals are in general, but I think sometimes as they're doing that, like on Days Like These, I think that Alan's vocals kind of overwhelm Mimi's in a way that they're mixed, where it feels like the interplay between the two of them doesn't feel as like precisely calibrated. I don't know.
I think that's sort of a deliberate choice, especially in the way like you consider the structuration of that song, like because that first verse is just like it's just them, and then the second verse is when it starts introducing that like gnarly distortion until it's all consumed up in that way. And I think like the structuration is just so deliberate in a lot of these songs. I love just like this is one of those records that like I go back to specifically for like little individual moments, like around like I want to say like 2.5 minutes in All Night, like they just start letting that bass crank up, and like Mimi is just singing like over the top of it, like just like little la la la's like over this like insane wall of noise.
It's really cool. I think my thing with this record in general is that I think sonically it really, really takes a step forward from Double Negative, where I think the experimentation on that album was so much more like heavy-handed, where you could like with Quorum, like you could really see like, all right, we're going to take this thing that you're familiar with and then we're going to destroy it in this very specific way. And in this record, I feel like they take it in a more interesting direction, where I'm kind of cribbing some stuff from the Hot Singles episode they did where they discussed this album. But like this album is so much chunkier. It's so much more kind of sharp edged in the distortion elements of it, and the way that these things kind of don't feel like, it doesn't feel like a fuzz of distortion. It feels like these big icicle like chunks that are like grinding up against each other. It's so like brutal and so kind of violent in the way that the distortion is working with their voices, and like all of that I think is awesome and better than the last album and like really cool. My thing is that I don't connect as much with like the songs underneath, with besides Hey and besides White Horses. Like, I don't know. There are so many moments on Double Negative that like I can recall in my head right now as these little like catchy earworms, like Always Trying to Work It Out and Dancing in Blood and Dancing in Fire and Tempest and Rome and Poor Sucker. Like these very like kind of weirdly catchy moments that emerge from the kind of muck. And on this record, I think like the muck is the draw for me here, and the songwriting I don't think is necessarily as strong. But there are also moments on this record like Hey where the songwriting goes really hard. I think Hey is an incredible progenitor of the Midwest mindset. The lyrics of hey, we didn't get past Michigan and Lake before we find ourselves beneath the weight. Like, that's just fucking, that's the Midwest mindset.
That's Midwest as hell.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the mindset right there, baby.
That is the intro to this life that I have been living, because this album came out like 2 weeks after I moved here, so it was very, it's very funny to hear those lines in such close proximity to just kind of being submerged into that lifestyle. I do wanna so this is in my like top 5 this year, this album, but I also want to say that like part of me, like as I've been kind of reflecting on as we've been like talking about this conversation, I do think that like personally I feel a little bit more of an affinity toward Double Negative as kind of more of a kind of cohesive project of sorts that feels like it's always kind of building on that momentum and has like a number of these kinds of mini suites that like go throughout it that really feel like they're kind of, it's impossible to separate pieces of them. And I feel like the first half of this album is kind of where it is really at for me in terms of just mostly thinking about the White Horses, I Can Wait All Night trio, just to start it, is like one of the most insane runs of tracks that they've ever done.
Yeah.
I do want to I want to also give a little shout to specifically the last 2 songs on the album, just because I know Jackie said Disappearing is maybe the heaviest thing they have on here, but like more is fucking wild. Like the first time I listened to it, and you have Don't Walk Away, which is like the most tender and spare song on the album, and it immediately just slams into those guitars.
It's all distortion, no guitar.
Yeah, no, I Joker cackled during that. It was great, and that was another moment where it was like between that and like Days Like These, those were like one of the 2 moments where when I saw them live in the middle of like this pretty quiet field after sundown, everybody there was just kind of like mostly older couples in their 40s and up. Like when that distortion hit, I was just like cackling like the Joker, because I'm like, haha, yes, turn the dial all the way up. But I think my favorite on here, kind of as time has been going on, has been that Closer, The Price You Pay, mostly because I feel like I'm not as like overwhelming in my praise with Hey. It used to be surprisingly my least favorite on here, but I've kind of come around to it, especially kind of seeing it in that setting. But like I think The Price You Pay for me is the one that kind of fits in with the effect that I feel like Hey does with a lot of other people, just by virtue of kind of starting with this very kind of minimal riff and vocal melody that goes on throughout, and it slowly builds and compounds with like the production and the noise. And then the most striking thing here in terms of like BJ Burton knowing like when to pull back with like a lot of clarity is the point where all of it cuts out about like 5 or so minutes in, and it's just Alan and Mimi harmonizing before it goes like headlong right back into the noise. It's just, it feels like in the closer there, it becomes kind of like a microcosm of just what the rhythms of the album are in general.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I as I said, like I really like both records, and it's not even like I kind of prefer the approach of Double Negative, or I kind of prefer. There are things that I like more about each of them, and there are things that I like less about each of them, and neither of them quite gets to like this is hitting me really. Like I still, if I had to pick, would probably pick one of the early Low records as my favorite. Like I really like slowcore Low. I really like Words, and if I could live in hope, I believe is the 2001 record that I also really like. But I still think that both of these albums, while neither one of them gets quite there to being like, oh, this is top 5 album of the year for me, like this really, really, really works, I think they've gotten a little closer to what they're like trying to hack away at with this record. And I think sonically, just kind of writing this off as, oh, they're doing another BJ Burton record, like I think it's doing really interesting new things. And I think that I'm still really fascinated to see like where this band goes from here. And I also wish I could have seen this live, because I saw Low at Pitchfork Fest after Double Negative along with some of y'all, and that was really fucking sick. And the way they translate these songs live I think is really cool and adds a lot of appreciation to them that I wish I could have had for this record, but I didn't quite get there where and this is a record that's done really well this year. Like this record like dominated the college radio charts all fall long this year. Did really, really well and generally like has been critically beloved. And I love that for Low. I think that's really neat. And I think this is a very cool album for people to kind of gather around. It just didn't quite do it for me in the same way, where I think I'm more coming back to Hey as an individual song and a couple moments here and there. But this is pretty fucking wild that they're this many years into their career and that they have found such fertile new ground to explore as a band. Like, it's so rare that you have one of these legacy acts that feels like 20 years into their career, they're just now starting to access like the full language of their music and the full like expanse of their expression. I just don't think they've quite nailed their classic album in this mode yet, and I think they'll get there. I think if one more BJ Burton record might be the one for me where I'm like, oh, this is the one. But I like this record a lot too.
Well, alrighty then.
Speaking of critical consensus,
This is the
time for the number 3 most
Parents'
acclaimed record of this year.
the end of a very, very long sequence of dominoes, which started, of course, with one
And a real
person.
shocker, I would say, for the Indieheads pod that it didn't get number 1.
It was a shocker.
Wait. I think
Well,
you are
It's
skipping an
fine,
album.
like we're not getting into that.
No, I don't think we are.
Okay, maybe I'm misunderstanding the tee up. Continue. My bad.
Our next record that we are talking about today, our number 2 record on the list. Who could have predicted? It's Japanese Breakfast, people.
Hey, we're still us.
We're
The Indieheads
still
podcast
still
liking a
us.
Japanese breakfast record?
Obviously we have joked often about how this is just the rest of the critical world catching up to our podcast and to So AJ, and how that this year is just the payoff of a years long bit. But this is also not a bit, because we've been very sincere from the beginning that like this isn't just a meme. We legitimately think Japanese Breakfast might be the best artist in the world right now. Like Psychopomp, we were not exaggerating when we were calling it the GOAT and all that stuff. And in the years since, it feels like the rest of the indie world has caught up to how hyped Jeremiah and AJ are. And now this is the year in the album that we're really fully having the Michelle Zauner moment, obviously helped by the fact that she put out her memoir this year, Crying in H Mart, which is a New York Times bestseller that's now being turned into a fucking movie. Like, Michelle Zauner has gone Jimmy Fallon big, folks. It's happened. But the way that she did it, it feels very of a piece with the rest of her career. It feels like the logical extension of where the last album was going in a really satisfying way. It feels like a pivot in some ways, but also not really. Like, I mean, the thing we've brought up over and over again with this record is that she called this album her happy album or her joyful album, and this is an album with the lyric, with my luck, you'll be dead within the year, I've come to expect it. That's a lyric on this album that she calls her.
It's the first lyric on one song.
It is the first lyric on a song, which is fucking, like, Jesus Christ, lady. Like, but also, I kind of do get what she's going, like, sonically, this album is obviously a lot brighter and more uplifting in the sound that's going for, even as she's lacing that with like this undercurrent of pain that is still very much there in her music. But like, I really think this record works. I liked it at first when I first heard it. Like, I definitely didn't take a while to come around to it, but at first I was like, this is pretty good. There are a lot of songs I really like on it, but this isn't coming close to either of the last 2 Japanese Breakfast records. I thought it was a definitive, like, this is not her best record. This is her number 3 record, but it's still good. And over time, it keeps creeping up closer and closer to the other 2, in my estimation. It's still probably my least favorite of the 3, if I simply have to pick. But I think they all do their own thing so distinctly that, like, I'm just really satisfied with where this album leaves us with Japanese Breakfast, both expanding the scope of what she does, maintaining the core element that made it so appealing in the first place, and like building off of it substantially in a way that's just like, yeah, give me whatever the next fucking album is. Like, I'm so ready for it still. Like, this is still, you're still the best, Michelle. We've realized now. All of us have realized.
I see. I am unfortunately in the first camp, so I'll get my stuff out now, just so y'all can go crazy about it. But I think this is like, it's a good album. I think it's solid. It's like a 7, but like it is definitively for me the third. You know, like Soft Sounds is like the towering monument to greatness up there at the top. Psychopomp is like a nice second place spot, and you're just like, and then there's this one, which is just like a lot more humble and kind of pleasant, and I think it really just kind of exceeds on the strength of like the first half of it. I think that's really where it excels for me, is like those singles with Paprika, B Sweet, and B Sweet right next to each other, and then also Posing in Bondage and Sit, like and Savage Good Boy, but like those bits right there are just like, those are kind of the meat of the record for me, is like those bigger popular songs, because like I feel like as soon as she tries to settle back into, you know, the more like textural guitar stuff that she's done in the last ones, it kind of slips a little bit, which is odd, because like you'd think like, oh, this, you know, poppy tribute stuff like Cyndi Lauper style material would be like maybe not as much the strength of her songwriting, but for some reason it really feels like it. And like I don't know, I've just felt a mixed bag all year, and I've tried repeatedly to unpack it and just never really had it, you know.
Yeah,
I don't want to do too much like, I don't know, discography comparison, but it is just like something to address that this is like probably the superficially meanest we're ever going to be to an album that is our number 2 of the year, and like rightfully so.
Yeah, like,
it's just that it's coming after 2 like back-to-back 11 out of 10 album of the years for us.
For reference, her last 2 were in number 10 and number 3 of our 200 albums of the decade.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. 2 top 10 albums of the decade, like, in a row. And so, like, this Jubilee, unfortunately, has the deck stacked against it a little bit. And I want to make very clear that, like, it's just coming down from a truly, like, impossible standard that no one should hit ever. But this is still an album that is, like, you know, a 9 for me, is a great album that I like as it's growing on me over time. I have very few quibbles with. I think it's very good. It deserves to be this high on our list. It is just, yeah, you have to kind of get the thing out of the way of like, but it's not the first 2, but also like nothing is the first 2 Japanese breakfast records. So like setting that aside, this album is really great. It's a really nice sort of like, you know, it's both refining what has come before it and is sort of, you know, gesturing to some exciting new avenues ahead of it. I'm glad that, like, even though I think Michelle Zauner is now having the year she should have had in 2017, I'm glad she's getting that year regardless, that it is truly, like, year of the Zaun, where she is getting, like, a great book, a great album, and then a great, like, soundtrack in all in one year, and being properly recognized for it, finally, like, fucking rules. And so, you know, even if nothing is going to have the particular like time and place relationship that Soft Sounds and Psychopomp do for me, like this, you know, I'm seldom ever probably going to complain about like anything that Michelle Zauner does. And like, as a result, you know, I have very few complaints about this album. Especially, I want to stick up for the back half. I think too. The back-to-back of In Hell and Tactics is like one of the strongest back-to-backs in a career that, like, my God, has In Heaven through to the Woman That Loves You in it. Like those 2 songs together hold up against that. Yeah, I will to stump for those 2 songs quickly.
I will so go ahead and back you up there. For me, I definitely felt the way that Rose felt at first, where the first half of the record is like very immediate. It's some of the poppiest arrangement of her career, especially I think Paprika is like, Be Sweet was a really, really good, smart first single. Paprika is like the revelation of this album for me, where it really feels like not only do I like this as much as I like the highest highs of the Japanese breakfast discography, but this also feels like it's doing something new and different. And the way that those horns, like it feels very kind of like Sufjan Stevens Illinois-y, but like also very Beirut kind of twee pop in its own way, and like there's just so many nice influences that are melding really beautifully on this record, and kind of expanding on some of the kind of 80s sounding stuff in the last record and making it more explicitly pop. And then of course the record takes a steer into Painesville, as any Japanese breakfast record does. And at first I definitely had some bumps with like how this record is sequenced, and I never had the moment with this record where I was just like, oh, I get it now, every single thing is clicking into place. It kind of happened bit by bit, where like I would go back to it and I'm like, all right, I like it a little bit more now, and this time around I get Sit, or I get In Hell. Like my third listen or whatever was like when In Hell all of a sudden just like jumped out of nowhere and hit me over the head like, you idiot, you were missing this the whole time. And then like similarly with each listen, like another part of it will click into place bit by bit by bit. And now I'm at the point where I have like almost no quibbles with the record, but I didn't get there right away. And I think that's partly just because the idea flow of this record is not, it's sequenced very well, but it just feels like there's more that she's trying to fit into this record in a way that makes it sometimes feel like she's jumping from one idea to another in a way that doesn't feel as fluid. And like, I don't really like Posing in Bondage as much as some other people do, and I don't really like Savage Good Boy as much as some other people do, but there is no stinker on this record. There is no song that like does not work, and there is no song that feels like it's superfluous, like with the Billy record. Like it's 10 songs, it flows really well, and it ends with Posing for Cars, which also recently just clicked for me because I realized that Posing for Cars is just reverse Diving Woman. It's diving, it's outro Diving Woman, where Diving Woman is like, we're gonna start with just this dreamy guitar as a way to like segue you into the album and communicate this like emotional tapestry that we want to set up before Michelle even like gets into it. And this is basically the opposite, where Michelle even said like, I basically wanted to set up this story, and then I want the guitar solo to like complete the emotional narrative arc of the story, and I want the rest of the feeling of the song to be communicated in this long jammy outro that is like putting Diving Woman at the end rather than at the beginning, which I think is really, really neat. And the more I revisit this album, I'm like, okay, I get what she was doing with the sequencing, and I get why every single song is on here, and I really like it all. It just hasn't like magically cohered together the way that Psychopomp and the last one just both hit me like a truck from moment one. And that's not a fair standard to hold her up to, obviously. Like sometimes records take a while to get all the way around your brain, and like especially when you have really high expectations. Like I think this is a good example of that. Just you gotta give it time and allow the nuances of the record to sort of like get used to. And so I think that's why you see some people that are like not as long time invested with Japanese breakfast being like, oh, this is the one that I like immediately more than the others, because there's more immediacy to parts of it, and then there are also more parts to unlock over time, as opposed to the other ones, which like it was like you were being hit with all of it all at once, but also there was so much nuance and depth to be like plumbed as at the same time. And this record, it just feels like those steps are kind of happening independently of each other. Like it feels like I'm having to do more mental work to like square it all in my head and be like, okay, I see how this part fits with that part. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think nuance is like a good word to single out, because there's so much like refinement and sophistication going on here, and like such a sort of delicate way to push like the concept of what a Japanese breakfast album is forward in a way that does also like rob it of a little bit of some of that, again, like brick in face immediate impact that those first two albums had. But it's, you know, it's one that is a slower burn, but that has percolated a lot for me over time. And like more and more, where initially there were songs that didn't click with me, like you said, like Posing for Cars is one that recently I finally kind of like capital G got for the first time all year. And I think, you know, slowly, I know, even though I'm not there yet with it, that this is an album that is going to like, you know, rise to the standard of the other Japanese breakfast albums for me, even if it's not going to happen as quickly. And I like appreciate her, like that's somewhat of a bold move to make, like coming 4 years after that initial run, to sort of neither stay the course nor make like a hard left in a way that would really register to like, new fans and old people, to be like, look, we're still going to play with the same palette here, but we're just going to, ever so subtly and tastefully, push at the edges of it in a way that's, going to signal, I guess, just how much longevity and how much more like breadth and variety that this project can have, which is cool. I appreciate her doing that.
I was real quickly just piggybacking off of that. Like, we're also talking about how like I joked early on about how ridiculous it is to call this her Joy album, but going off of that point of nuance, like I think the thing that has made this record for me so interesting to kind of mull over time is that the quote unquote joy elements here, like the more poppy instrumentation, the brightness of it, and the really fuck me up parts, like I think this album is really about exploring the nuances of those feelings. And it's not that like the joy is a kind of misnomer. It's that I think In Hell is the perfect example of how Michelle even says like, this might be the saddest song I've ever written, is the comment she left on Genius. And also like, but like In Hell has one of the poppiest structures on the album, and that doesn't feel like it's just a simple like juxtaposition hey ya style where it's like, let's make a upbeat pop song with sad lyrics and people won't realize the lyrics are sad. It's not that. It's a song about the fact that being in love is simultaneously the greatest and worst thing that can ever happen to you. And it's about how it's both of those things simultaneously, and about how the moment that you fall in love with, hell is finding someone to love and I can't have you, because it's simultaneously like, oh, you complete me, but also I'm dependent on you now. You complete me, but also now I'm inevitably going to lose you. And that that I can't have you forever is this thing to own, that is this bond that is special because it is tenuous, but it is also finite because it is tenuous. And like how it is containing those multitudes at once makes it so much more than just, oh, this is a song that has a happy chord progression but sad lyrics. It's like, no, this is really getting to the heart of how any human emotion, when you really like open up the hood and unpack what's going on underneath there, is going to have like complex nuances to it. It's like The Beach Bum in that way, where that movie is just a fun, silly, happy time.
Hour 3.5 of recording. Jackie invokes The Beach Bum.
That movie is a fun, silly, happy time, but it is also profoundly sad in a way that I think people don't give it credit for, and has this like depth of feeling to it that I think people don't give it credit for because it's very silly. And I think this is a different sort of version of that, where it's like there is a lot of like brightness and poppiness, but that shouldn't necessarily contradict our idea that this thing could be emotionally like deep. Like those things can exist side by side with each other.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think it's a really great
so I should chime in here because I want to say my piece about this before we move on, but like I want to approach this as kind of like I feel like of the four of us, I am the most Japanese breakfast agnostic. I was kind of always agnostic about Psychopomp, which was an album that I liked but didn't quite love. And like Soft Sounds, I was initially the same way before it kind of post-transition really kind of started resounding with me in a way that it has with like a lot of the other like pod trans women. But like I think for me, my initial sort of reaction to this was kind of seeing it as a kind of reconciling that it was going to be another one of those situations with me where I was like, oh cool, everybody else has like a Japanese breakfast album that they're going to like really appreciate and love, and I'm just going to sit here and be like, that's sweet, that's nice, I'm just gonna sit back from my corner. And like first listen of this, it kind of hit that territory where like the first half or so of the album and that first run, I was with it as sort of a way of switching things up while also keeping that emotional nuance that we've been talking about in a way that like I felt like was going to be the thing that clicked with me. And then like the second half of this album, mostly because I kind of on release weekend, this kind of got oversaturated for me because I was like engaging in both like podcast group discussion plus also like people that I knew IRL who were starting to have their like Jay Brecky breakthrough moments, and so was just like listening to this album multiple times that first weekend, and it got to the point where like by that time, like the multiple listens in, like the back half was starting to like wear on me somewhat. But like weirdly enough, as I've kind of cooled the burners on this, let it kind of like percolate throughout the year, it's kind of been coming together for me in a way like more immediately than like either of her prior two releases. Not to say that it's like my favorite that she's done, but it is certainly one where I think I'm getting a better grasp on the emotional arc of the album as a whole the more that I sit with it, especially kind of how it starts with that first 4-track run that is at least like sonically more kind of upbeat than where it kind of takes that turn on Posing in Bondage and kind of goes throughout the rest of the album, to the point where now like that like closing trio of In Hell, Tactics, and Posing for Cars, that was pretty much where my patience had kind of like worn out a bit, especially on the outro to Posing for Cars, kind of strikes me as where a lot of the emotional resonance that the album has been building to is kind of able to just kind of spill over and unfold, to the point where it's the big culmination of the album, the kind of expressions and emotions that Michelle has built this entire album up to represent. It almost kind of feels like with that outro, there's no way of kind of putting words to it. It feels like it's her way of saying all she has to say leading up to what that is meant to represent, but knowing that any sort of way of expressing it is kind of insufficient and doesn't do it justice. And kind of in that context, and like listening to it like on my own terms, it's been something where I've kind of started to wrap my head around the album as more of a cohesive whole, and in a way that I've been more appreciative of as the months have gone on. I'm I'm just sitting here as other people are kind of debating the album, just being like, I just think it's neat. I
also think it's just neat, to be clear.
I'm all for Michelle getting to do her thing and getting this arc that she's been getting, and I'm happy that she's getting lauded for it. And like, hopefully there will be someday an album of hers that will like absolutely home run, knock it out of the park, and like win me over. But at the very least, like the fact that I've like wrapped my head around this one in the speed that I have, like actually in the year that it got released in, is to me like a big sort of thing in terms of my appreciation for her stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of home runs, we gotta leave time to talk about our album of the year as Rose dramatically turns around. Okay. Before we dive into this,
can we get Matty to hit the fucking music?
No, I want to make a couple points clear here. Again, this is important preamble. Okay, we the pod transes hold these truths to be self-evident. All right. Number 1, the night explodes in the light from a shooting star. All right. Number 2, this includes all things beautiful and warm reflected in your heart. Number 3, because all broken creatures are perfect just the way they are. And number 4, it's easy to be disillusioned when you don't know who you are, because number 5, it can live forever in your heart. It can live forever in your sick, pathetic little heart. A consensus album of the year. Baby, we did it. It's Lily Was Right season. Black Dresses Forever in Your Heart are somehow fucking album of the year. I did not know this cue was coming.
There we go.
I sent it to Matty between the episodes just to do that.
Right. I am so excited to talk about this record. I'm so excited to talk about this record with you all. And I also want to be clear for people. We knew this was coming. We knew that there was not a consensus album this year, and that if we all put our might behind this, that we might be able to make this happen. But we did not deliberately vote collude. We did not all put this number 1.
Yeah, we thought, hey, we can get it a number 3.
We were genuinely gunning for top 3 here, just based off our own honest feelings, and somehow no consensus.
Then all of a sudden, I get a message in my Discord, and I see the vote tallies, and immediately my response was just, "We did it, Joe." Like, we did it. We had the votes. We were able to get it across the line, and now we're able to enact our agenda, which is Black Dresses number 1.
Hell yeah, baby. Say that. It takes me back to 2018, to the 2018 top 10 voting, in which, me being in my cup slayer, I'm like, hey, these black dresses, you guys gotta check out this Black Dresses album. It, a lot of promise here, real good. And it was a lone wolf on the ballot, hovering near the bottom. And just 3 years later, to finally, actually almost 4 years after Waste Isolation came out, to have them as the consensus vote is, the way things change. And like I was, to get into earnest territory with this, was really thinking about this the other day, like in terms of the Black Dresses arc, and to like think back to Waste Isolation. I think of other anecdotes where people have mentioned about like artists coming out, with an idea in a time when there was just like no context for them. Like if you were to put Waste Isolation in the landscape of early 2018 when it came out, Oil of Every Pearl's on Sides hasn't happened yet. There's no concept of hyperpop. New metal revivalism hasn't happened yet. There are all these like cultural waves that have kind of crested at this exact moment that like Black Dresses were really ahead of the curve of and helped to pioneer, but to such an extent that no one really understood it at the time. Like, I love Waste Isolation. That's a great record that deserved to be in a top 10 that year. But like, I understand the like bafflement that can occur of like, okay, so they're doing like this industrial thing, but there's these almost like rap like cadences over it, and there's this whole new metal vibe, but then also this like experimental electronic side of things that is coming from somewhere else, and like what the fuck is happening here? And somehow they have just aged into being the torchbearers for this entire like radical wave within pop music, where it's like, yeah, they were there on the ground floor of a lot of all this stuff that is starting to really, really, crystallize, like not even just in the alternative world, but in like the mainstream as well. And, it feels fitting that they are our album of the year this year specifically, because again, it's not just the Lily Was Right year, it's kind of like the Black Dresses was right year. Like they called their shot 3 years ago and have only been building on that and refining on it ever since. And now it feels like, yes, the rest of the world is finally ready to like get in on the just fucking mountains of incredible stuff that is being presented here. It feels like their time. It's their time.
I would like to speak. This is their best album.
It does help.
Yes,
it does help. I would like to speak.
I waffle between this and thank you, but like I feel like this is the one.
As the newest to the Black Dresses canon, not just because I was the last one to come out as trans, but as someone who, to be fair to Lily, part of the reason why I was not there for you in 2018 is, as I literally said to you, I was afraid that something would be awoken in me. I was right. I was exactly right. But I was not ready for this, for the Black Dresses, either musically or spiritually at that particular juncture in my life. And I also think that over time, they have figured out a way to better and better like hone and harness the organized chaos of their music into something that I think is able to like penetrate beyond just this kind of somewhat insular community that partly is insular just because people outside of trans circles generally tend to view trans art as like niche and as it's like specifically for these group of people and their life and their circumstances. And what I think has been so cool about these last couple Black Dresses albums is not just that like it's nice that Anthony Fantano is reviewing these records and like taking them very seriously, but it's more so that like they've figured out a way to write music that simultaneously is not just being reduced down to like, let's all consume this trans suffering. And it's also not like neutering it or anything. It's what they do is that, and they've talked about this, they said like, especially starting on Peaceful as Hell, like they've started writing about their emotions and their issues they're going through in these more abstract ways that are less about like explicit transness and are more about the kind of emotions that are arising out of it. And a lot of people are like, hey, this album sounds like it's about the end of the world, and it was just hilarious because that's how like trans people dealing with the many conflicting emotions like reads to the rest of the world. Like, oh, this is music about the apocalypse, clearly, because like there's a war being fought inside of these people. But it's also just like So I think the way that this record manages to tap into things that everyone is feeling right now, in the way because the whole world is being brought to the same kind of position of precarity and inability to project into the future that trans people have been living with our entire lives. I think there's just this nice coalescing of like the people in the world being more receptive to black dresses, but also the world being more appropriate for the music that black dresses are making now more than ever. And the way that this album is specifically like from the very beginning positing this idea of how can we build something beautiful with no hope? How can we create something beautiful out of a world, a planet, a country that is so antagonistic to the very idea of hope and beauty? And how this record just fucking does that, just sets out to do the mission that it sets out for itself at the beginning and just totally achieves it on every possible level. Like, I really do believe that if it, this record is obviously made for me in what I'm going through this year, in the circumstances of my life. Like, of course, this record fucking hits for me, but like, I really do believe that if I was some different person with another set of circumstances, like, I would really appreciate this record still, because it's just doing so much musically, lyrically, that I think is like a top fucking notch. And this is the record where it really all clicked into place for me. And I've gone back and I appreciate the rest of their catalog more now, for sure, for obvious reasons. But I also still think this is like by fucking far the best thing that they've ever done. I really think it's incredibly special.
Yeah, and I think to a degree they like that. You mentioned that shift in their writing. I think it definitely has helped a lot more, because like they've talked a lot about, you know, not wanting to be boxed into like the idea that all of their songs are about transness in particular, because like you know, this is a multifaceted spectrum of pain that these people are dealing with, unfortunately.
Yeah, and,
you know,
and
like
trans artists, whenever they write art about pain, there's this like inherent reading that happens with cis audiences that's like, oh, if you're in pain, it's because you're trans. Like that.
yeah,
All of that
exactly.
has
And
to
it's
be
like
filtered through that
you're
prism.
completely disregarding like the symptoms of like, you know, chronic pain sufferers and things like that, and just like little individual parts of struggle, which I feel like this album really tries to delve into. Like Natalie wrote a really great essay about this, like the kind of thesis statement of this album being like a kind of multifaceted look at pain and all its dimensions and the way it affects you, and like just seeing it from other people's perspectives, like especially on Perfect Teeth, a song that kind of just dives into like, oh yeah, there are people who are just like worlds beyond this, who have no idea what is going on, and they try to judge us. Like, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, so I as somebody who this is like my favorite album of the year, and as somebody who has I want to say it was like no coincidence, but like literally like the start of the pandemic last year was when I started getting heavily black dresses pilled, which I think is there's a lot going on there. But as I've been kind of getting into them, I was always, I think they have made nothing but great albums, but there was always, every single one of them, there was always something where it was like, well, this doesn't really like hit on the particulars of like what is really resonating with me quite as much as say like one or two other albums in any given year. Like it would always be like there was something kind of that felt a little bit like it was like keeping me a little bit distance, and something about this one is kind of what allowed it to kind of fully barrel through the wall that was between me and that. And it's to jump off of what Rose was saying, because I don't want to go into all of what I was saying in that album of the year piece, just because I feel like I said whatever I'm going to say far more eloquently in that than just rambling off the dome here. But like, what is striking to me the more that I've spent time with this album and kind of reconciling how it fits into the rest of the Black Dresses canon is that where it is ultimately kind of landing down on, and particularly on what I feel is one of the most pivotal songs on the album, Understanding, is that it's not trying to make an album about pain. It is the crux of that song is kind of its own sort of self-critical way in which Devi and Rook are re-examining kind of how they write about pain and how they talk about suffering, and this idea of, okay, so we can write this into our songs in order to try to be understood by other people, but maybe it doesn't need to be understood. Maybe it's not going to be taken in good faith or good charity. There's no way to kind of get the sort of catharsis and closure that we need by like going for it in that capacity. And which is why I think what Jackie brought up as the kind of thesis statement of the album of can we make something beautiful with no hope being like right at the top of the album becomes the kind of overhanging question, where rather than dwelling on a sense of pain and like where it might stem from, it's more concerned with kind of how can one find any sort of comfort or solace in a world that is like full of this pain that can't be reconciled with. And it comes down to a lot of things that have been kind of core tenets throughout Black Dress's music in terms of just finding community and solidarity with other people who understand you and can like take you on good faith and like who you can trust with these sorts of vulnerable things. And that is very clear as this album deepens the kind of dynamics between Rook and Devi and kind of their interplay and these like exchanged little dialogue pieces between verses or like in outros, that sort of thing. But on top of that, just kind of, I think the last sort of thing why this album has really kind of resonated for me is just, it just fucking slams. It's just a great fucking album from start to finish. And it feels like the one of these that has, for me at least, like every single second counts. Like every single thing that it is doing feels very integral to the kind of both sonic, thematic, emotional kind of flow of the album and kind of how it's filtering through all these different ideas, jumping through all these different ways of examining what it is doing. And also it feels like, to bounce off of the point that we're talking about, like everybody else has kind of gotten on the new metal revival train and they're like, oh, that's cool, we're gonna like turn up the notch another like 5 dials and make this like one of the like heaviest guitar albums of our entire career.
Yeah, so
I
nasty.
mean, Peace Sign opening and Concrete Bubble, like that back to back is just absurd. Like just how heavy they managed to get with it. Also, I want to note the Bandcamp tags include jock jams, which is like
Thank you.
Not inaccurate in places.
No, it
is.
isn't.
Like you listen to Zero Ultra and you're just like, oh, they're not kidding.
Yeah, I totally agree with. First of all, everything you wrote in that piece was really great, Natalie. I really loved that. Loved your analysis of all that, and totally agree that like understanding is really the thing that this whole really it's the trio of understanding, Perfect Teeth, and Mistake that is kind of the emotional centerpiece of the record, but specifically that idea from Understanding where Devi says, I tried to offer up my pain to be understood, but I don't think it's my pain that can be understood or needs understanding. There's not a lot of pain in the world that makes any sense. Maybe people need to be understood instead. That line, like, it reminds me of the people were showing a lot of Eve Babbitt's quotes because she passed away this week, and she had this great quote about how I was told my whole life that like success would make you happy, and I learned immediately that like success doesn't make you any happier, and that the only thing that makes you truly happy is having a conversation with someone else who gets it, and having a conversation with someone else who you can unload your bullshit with, and they can be like, yeah, no, I totally get what you mean by that. Like, and how that's different than offering up your suffering in art and having people interpret it, and how that's different in an interpersonal level, and the way that this record is then getting into the reaction to their previous music, and specifically the incident that caused them to break up as a band. In case you're not familiar with the discourse, and we're not going to get into the discourse, but basically what the origin of this record is that Black Dresses broke up last year, quote unquote. They basically said that they're done making music as a band, and that they basically, part of the reason why that they were deciding to call it quits was because they had this part of a song, I believe it In My Mouth. Is it that one from Waste Isolation?
No, there are several songs on Waste Isolation that like deal with past experiences of theirs very candidly that ended up sort of like
becoming a meme,
getting misused, or like willfully sort of like recontextualized, and they took issue with, and then just got like bandwagon for vocalizing the issue they took with it. And so they decided to like not expose themselves to that kind of like, I don't even know the word, like toxicity or whatever.
Yeah.
And then these two just can't stop writing songs together. They're too good at it.
They released a statement that said hilariously, "We're no longer a band, unfortunately, period. Regardless, we've decided to keep putting out music," which is
also just like the best distillation of the Black Dresses sensibility.
Yes. Also one of the best album announcements of all time.
It's great.
Period.
They just came in and they were like, "Hey, we have something for you on Valentine's Day." It's just like, oh, it's an album.
Yeah, I was like, oh, cool, like a final like farewell single or whatever. Nope, brand new album and one of their best. It is like, it's like the Billy album in that the nitty gritty of the songwriting on here, and with a lot of Black Dresses albums, is just like so boringly perfect. Like, if you haven't heard it, like go listen and you will see some of the most just like, it is so consistently inventive and imaginative and unpredictable and yet totally coherent and effective, like songbooks at this point, basically, like in the musical landscape. And they keep managing to hit that standard of quality to a point where it's really difficult to talk about. But yeah,
because they've written it also perfectly. Like I could spend the whole podcast breaking down about how the album interweaves these themes of like pain and trauma and the solidarity that you get when you have someone that understands you, and particularly the relationship between two trans people who can understand each other in a level that's just like not something else anyone else can tap into, and how their connection and their chemistry on every record just gets like better and better and better. Like I think every Black Dresses album, to me, there is one of the two that kind of takes the lead on every record. Like I think Peaceful as Hell, I think of as being an Ada album, and I think of this as being a Devi album, even though
this is a real Devi album.
Even though the whole point of the project is that they're constantly it's all about the interplay between them, so it seems silly to like ascribe them in that way, but it really does feel like on this record, Ada is playing the support role most of the time, where Devi is the one that's really kind of getting at the kind of she gets to deliver a lot of the like real emotional centerpiece moments of the album, like I was talking about with Perfect Teeth and Mistake, because I think a lot of the record is particularly talking about her own relationship with child sexual assault and how that was a lyrical topic in the past and how that then was taken out of context. And she has the incredible couplet in Perfect Teeth where she says, "People think it's edgy what I lived through, but I'm all sparkle and shit. I'm the nicest person. I'm just like my Little Pony. I'm just like cartoons." And that's so silly to me. If that's your idea of being edgy, I guess that's good for you, that you must have a nice life, a real nice life. And then that being followed up with Mistake, which is just like the saddest song ever written, maybe. I tried to...
a song so sad it's like basically inappropriate to talk about.
No, yeah. Recorded over what sounds like a literal child's sample Casio keyboard.
And like similarly, Tiny Ball is recorded over like the iPhone metronome app.
Yes. I think we've spent too much time talking about this album without mentioning that this album has the lyrics, "My pussy like a bulldozer, my pussy like a blown out speaker."
That's a good point.
That's the thing, is like even when they're
talking about very real, like just painful things, they will find the time to record a song as silly as that on some level, and even then, like.
And then make it incredibly painful by the end.
Like girls, now I'm just like the other girls. It's like one of the most brutal lyrics you've ever heard. You're just like,
to make a song that like started with a tweet that like we all thought was just a tweet and wasn't actually going to end up being actual Black Dresses lyrics, to run with that as far as you can, and then have it like wrap around to be this like devastatingly poignant and apt and uncomfortable statement about like, I think what a lot of trans women's relationships like with cisnormativity are, it's just no other band is doing this stuff, really.
And no other band is
so much of
that
like
kind of depth with moments like them saying "my pussy like a," and then the distortion sound. That's the funniest joke anyone has made on an episode on an album all year. Like that piece of production design is funnier than any like lyric on the Zach Fox album or whatever. But
Yeah, bested maybe only by the I need somewhere to spit in here at the end
Oh
of
my God.
Silver Bells.
Yes.
Really, they've improved everything, even the inner song skits, like the little bits
Yeah.
where like Rook is like shouting her lungs out during Concrete Bubble, and Debbie's just going like, "Yeah."
Or they're like, "Are
It
you
kills
for
me every
real
time.
okay though?" I
Well,
forget
there's
which
so much-
song that
Yeah,
is.
the check-in that happens at the end
Yeah.
of one of those songs is so good.
It's Silver Bells. Yeah.
Yeah.
and like to bring it back around to like the ending, like I feel like "Can't Keep It Together" is like maybe one of the best like thesis statement songs
yeah.
they've ever made for just like their whole deal.
It's such a perfect
Like
pairing with
just
understanding.
those final lines of like, "I don't know what I need to be, hopeless dreaming, please take care of me. I know there's nowhere place for me, these ruined lives inside me scream. I couldn't keep it together, I couldn't make it last, I couldn't keep it together. But it's not that bad." Like, that's the thing, is like, they have each other, and in the end, despite everything, despite all of that, it's still, they still have each other.
Yeah, it is really a great, like, I'm trying to look at this from the other direction. This is a great gateway album for the rest of their like broader work as a whole, because it really does contain so many sort of like mission statement type songs, like that peace sign, the like building it out of trash is all that we have left at the end of Silver Bells. Like, you really understand what their broader mission statement as individual artists and as a band is through this album, and you also understand sort of like the stylistic palette they are playing with for all of their other music. Like, it is kind of like, even if it's not my personal favorite Black Dresses album, it is definitely like the Black Dresses album in a way, and it really rules to see them, you know, come back from the brink of being like a gone too soon, you know, cult band to sort of, you know, releasing this like, you know, career / like one band genre that they've established, almost like, you know, it's a definitive statement from them. And like, if you are listening this far and haven't heard a Black Dresses album, or, you know, this album, or like even a song of theirs, like, I really encourage you to do so, because even if you don't gel with it, this is music that is just so singular and distinct and exciting and novel that even if, you know, you don't necessarily find a way into it personally, which I think a lot of people could, especially with this album. So like, don't be scared away by the fact that Peace Sign opens with a fucking like chugging new metal riff. there are more layers to it than that. Like, you know, this is, you know, some of the most distinct and exciting and forward-thinking music that there is right now. And, you know, Black Dresses have really proven themselves to be, I think, one of the most, you know, forward-thinking and, you know, uniquely consistent and prolific bands on the landscape. And like, if you want a window into why that is the case and why they have developed, you know, such this like hushed reverence about them in such a short amount of time, like, even if you're not there yourself, like, listening to even just the first couple songs off this album will really give you a sense of like why they are this band that they become for so many people, and for like, you know, all of us as well. Is, you know, just listen to Black Dresses.
It's also
you're,
like
you're not gonna, even if you don't love it, you're not gonna regret like being exposed to it. Like, I think it should be reassuring to everyone that music of this nature exists.
I also think this is just one of the most quotable fucking albums I've ever heard in my life. Like, there are so many really poignant lyrics, but there are also so many just like you can clip them, and like the line "I wish I was faker so people would hate the fake me" that Ada screams on "We'll Figure It Out," which is one of the best songs on the record. And also,
and like maybe of all time.
it's so fucking catchy and good. I'm breaking it, it's broken. I open it, it's open is so great. But it also has another one of they have like 7 times on this record they give you the entire thesis statement of Black Dresses, and one of those times is when they say, "I don't give a shit if it doesn't work. I've done a lot of things and none of them worked." It's like this beautiful like nihilist optimism. It's like, we should try and give it our best effort because nothing's ever worked, so who fucking cares if this does? Like, it's so like liberating while like feeling so burdened down by like the weight of being alive at the same time, and how in a way that's similar to a lot of things we've talked about this episode, like those don't feel like contradictions. They feel like realistic depictions of how multifaceted being alive right now is, how being alive as a trans person right now feels, where it's simultaneously like, I love being trans, but I hate navigating the world this way, and how those things are not contradictory, and how they in fact are. It's the very fact that I love being trans that makes the fact that being trans is such a pain in the ass sometimes such a heartbreaking thing, because it doesn't have to be. And like how this record is able to communicate that in a way that obviously is going to mean a lot to us, but can mean a lot to a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And everything continues just like everything does, just like pain, just like love.
Yeah.
Lily was right. Can we all just agree?
Lily was right. Everyone.
Lily was right.
Lily was
Sound
right.
the
This is the
alarms.
year of Lily was right. Get ready for next year when I sneak an Under Oath album into our consensus 10.
We'll see. We'll see.
Mark my words. I'm planting the flag right now. It
I'm
might
already on
happen.
board. I've heard Voyeurist in its entirety, and I could be persuaded.
We'll see about. We'll follow up on that next year.
It's been a real treat to do this with y'all. This was a very lovely podcast to do. Just great time. I've had a great year just doing this. We did our spiel on the Album of the Year awards, but just it's really lovely.
Yeah, this is good stuff right here. Thank you all for listening through to and to Matty for enduring this like very long back-to-back recording session.
Yeah,
You signed up for this.
I mean, I guess I did, but we're coming up on 4 hours of recording, so
We sure are. Matty's tired. We should let Matty go.
I want to hang out with my girlfriend.
Yeah.
Go do that, Matty. You've earned.
You've earned
just
it.
like we talked about with AJ. You've earned your trans brownie points by recording us for 4
Yeah.
hours.
Yeah.
You've met your good ally quota for the week.
Oh boy. Well, folks, that wraps up our Album of the Year pods and our last podcast of 2021. So I don't know what we got. Next year, we've got a lot of stuff planned. We've talked about it extensively, so just be on the lookout. We'll probably take a little breather before we get into 2022 proper. But for now, hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and hopefully you liked our list. If you didn't like our list, well, hit up Gavin. Hit up Gavin and tell him, hey, I didn't like the list. Here's what I would want to do right. Because Gavon,
he'll agree with you.
Tell him to vote for Limp Bizkit some more. Maybe that'll get it up there. Because we all really love Still Sucks here, and we're sorry we didn't make the 10.
Honestly,
sorry. At least our number one has several Limp Bizkit-esque riffs on it. So, there's that as consolation.
Wes Borland, I don't know if Wes Borland has heard Black Dresses, but I know for a fact Wes Borland would like Black Dresses. I know 100%. In my heart.
We need a collab.
Ada had the tweet the other day about how she was like, I'll never get on Fred's level of rhyming ass with ass or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Well, that wraps up this pod. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we will see you all next year. Bye-bye.
Everything fits into place, seamlessly pieced together in the most terrible way. I couldn't keep it together, I couldn't make it last, I couldn't prove I was good. I wonder if anybody can't keep it together. Nothing is meant to last that long, but it doesn't make me feel better to put it in a stupid song. I wonder if life is all about just falling apart and painfully becoming something else. Breaking down inside every day. I'm a verge of hoping for something together. I couldn't make it last. I couldn't keep it together, but it's not.